Today is Monday, 19th January 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, as of today, we continue to be in the midst of this crisis between the United States and the European members of NATO, or at least some of them, on the topic of Denmark and Greenland. There's been all sorts of brave statements from all sorts of European officials about how they're prepared to stand by Denmark and they're prepared to stand by the people of Greenland. Though one important government in Northwest Europe, Britain, is proving remarkably reticent. Prime Minister Starmer very unwilling to make any positive or strong statements, either critical of the United States or supportive of Denmark, and avoiding, to the extent that he can, any suggestion or comment about any retaliatory action that Britain might make following Donald Trump's tariff announcement, which I discussed yesterday. Here, I ought to say that if Trump does indeed move forward with his 10% tariff, the 10% tariff he announced yesterday, which I discussed yesterday, there's some uncertainty, by the way, about whether this is in effect. That's always the case with Trump. About a week ago, as I remember, he announced a 25% tariff against countries that traded with Iran. I discussed this in my program at the time. There is no word at all that the United States government has taken any action so far to enforce such a tariff, and there's no word yet, no confirmation yet, that such a tariff is actually in effect. But assuming that this latest tariff, the one that Trump announced against the European states that were involved in supporting Denmark, assuming that that does take effect, well, of course, Britain is one, and it would be a devastating blow to the British motor car industry, to Range Rover in particular, which has had a difficult few months, by the way. It was the target of an extremely successful cyber attack. It's still unclear to me who was responsible for it. Anyway, Range Rover has come back from that, but its biggest single overseas market, as I understand it, is the United States. And I think if it were to lose access to that market, it would be a crippling blow for Range Rover, which is one of the stars of what is, in every other respect, a declining British motor vehicle industry. Just saying. And I can't imagine that either Bentley or Rolls-Royce, the two other famous British car brands, which also sell cars to the United States, very expensive cars, to the United States, I can't imagine that they would be happy by tariffs of this kind either. They're the sort of people who buy those cars probably could afford the extra price, just saying. Anyway, I've noticed that Keir Starmer has had very little to say about that. He has conspicuously not visited the car factories. He's not talked to the workers there. He's not given the kind of strong words of support that you might perhaps have expected at this critical moment. But anyway, putting all that aside, in Northwest Europe, the area targeted, you read, especially in the media, lots of excited comments, speculations about the devastating counteraction that the European Union or that the European countries might take. There's talk about activating a EU anti-coercion mechanism. I believe that was originally created, by the way, to counter threats of coercive actions by China. Just saying. Anyway, there's talk of activating that against Trump and the United States. I'm not sure what activating this particular law would actually mean in practice, but anyway, there's a lot of talk about it. There's talk about delaying ratification of the humiliating trade treaty that Ursula von der Leyen negotiated with the United States and which she agreed with Donald Trump at that dreadful summit meeting the two of them had in Scotland 7 months ago. The very fact that this treaty has not been ratified already tells you that there is opposition to it. But though it is true that the treaty was lopsided heavily in America's favor, that fact alone again demonstrates how much stronger the position of the United States is in these sort of things relative to the Europeans. And that perhaps is the major lesson of that treaty. And it is the lesson to remember when discussing this crisis over Greenland now. And of course, there continues to be speculation and talk and discussion about closing down American bases and that kind of thing. All of this is, in my opinion, so much hot air. I don't expect the Europeans to do any of these things for the reasons I discussed at great length in my program yesterday. In the meantime, President Trump himself shows no sign of backing down. He's just written another Truth Social post, again saying that the United States has been telling Denmark to take steps to protect Greenland from the Russians for 20 years, and the Danes have done nothing. And now, therefore, it is the United States that needs to move in and to take over Greenland, because the Danes and the Europeans are unable and unwilling to protect it from the Russians, who show no interest in it. But anyway, that is what Trump said. He's also given an interview in which he was asked whether some other arrangement short of outright annexation by the United States would do. And he said no, in order to really achieve security in Greenland, in order to make Greenland fully secure and to exploit it properly, you need possession. You need to actually be in possession, legal and physical possession of Greenland in order to be able to exploit it and to protect it properly. So various suggestions that have been floating around for leases, for all kinds of other arrangements to grant the United States all kinds of concessions, mining rights and exploitation rights and rights to build up US forces in Greenland, which by treaty, by the way, they already have anyway. Anyway, none of that will do for Donald Trump. He absolutely insists that it must be his, or perhaps more correctly, it must become the property, the territory of the United States. So he is not prepared to make any concessions there. And even as Trump has been talking in this very tough way, other US officials appear to be supporting him. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, being one. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, being another. Yes, there is pushback within the United States against this idea. There are people in Congress who are unhappy There are two Republican congressmen who apparently are joining a congressional delegation that is going to Greenland, who've spoken out against the president's policies. But I'm going to say straight away that looking at the pushback altogether within the United States, it doesn't seem to me particularly convincing or particularly strong. I don't see any real step taken by President Trump's opponents to try to rein him in. I don't see the Congress passing any resolutions or statements of support for Denmark and of criticism of the president. I don't see anything like that substantively happening in the United States, such as would cause Donald Trump to change his mind or to feel that this was not a policy worth pursuing. And, well, I have to say that I find that unsurprising. I think that for the United States, in the United States, certainly in the future, American politicians who argue against policy that will make the United States even bigger than it already is going to be very difficult. But I will return to that all shortly. In the meantime, as well as making all of these very tough statements about Greenland itself, Donald Trump has written a letter to the Prime Minister of Norway. And the reports say that the letter was also circulated by the United States government to European ambassadors in Washington, which is a way of saying that the administration did everything necessary to ensure that it got leaked to the media, which of course it has been. And the letter is actually quite interesting. It shows that Trump continues to harbour a massive grudge over the fact that he was not given the Nobel Peace Prize. He complains about this in the letter. He says that despite the fact that he settled, brought peace and ended 8 wars, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee nonetheless did not award him the Nobel Peace Prize. And he clearly feels angry and resentful about that. I've previously expressed my utter bafflement that Donald Trump should be bothered about the Nobel Peace Prize Committee's failure to award him this, as far as I'm concerned, empty and meaningless award. I suspect a lot of it goes back to deep resentment over the unjustified, wholly unjustified award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Barack Obama soon after he became president. And given the way that Trump feels about Obama, which he has never hidden, I don't find that surprising. But I still feel that for a president of the United States to feel so bothered about this issue is strange and belittles the president himself. Nonetheless, he does feel it. Maria Machado, the Venezuelan opposition leader, turned up in Washington a few days ago, met Trump, got very nice words from Donald Trump, but no word of support at all in relation to whatever political ambitions in Venezuela she may have. Anyway, Machado gave her Nobel Prize, her medal or whatever it is, to Donald Trump. Apparently this caused some annoyance in Norway. Well, all I will say about that is that just as Trump's obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize belittles him, so the way in which the Norwegians have administered the Nobel Peace Prize for many years belittles them. Their decision to award the Nobel Peace Prize to Machado, of all people, was, to my mind, clearly and even absurdly wrong. And given that they took the decision to give the Nobel Prize to a person like that, maybe they should not have been so surprised that she promptly handed it over to Donald Trump. Anyway, I'm not going to waste more time with this. Coming back to this letter, having brought up the topic of the Nobel Prize, Trump says that up to now, his great priority has been to achieve peace. That will no longer be his priority anymore, since all his work to achieve peace has not been rewarded by granting him the Nobel Peace Prize, which, by the way, I find another statement which belittles the president himself. I mean, it basically says that all of the work for peace that he's been doing up to now, since he became president again in January 2025, was to gain the Nobel Peace Prize. And now that he hasn't got it, well, the pursuit of peace, which, to repeat again, as far as I am concerned, is the overriding duty of a statesman. Anyway, that pursuit of peace for Donald Trump, because he didn't get the prize, is no longer so important to him. Anyway, that was one thing that he said. He said that he's not going to give up the pursuit of peace entirely, for which I suppose we should be grateful. But it's not going to be as important to him as it once was. From now on, he is going to be focused exclusively and narrowly on promoting the best interests of the United States. And he's not going to waste his time worrying what people in Europe, people like the Norwegians, the sort of people who administer peace prizes, think about him. Well, I have to say that to me, this letter wasn't so much addressed to the Norwegians. It was addressed to the European leaders as a whole. It seemed to me that what it was basically saying is that I don't give anything. I don't give a fig for what you think about me. I know what you think about me. I'm going to do what I consider important. My only point of reference is what I judge to be the interests of the United States. And as to your opinions of me and of what I'm doing, I couldn't care less. That, it seems to me, is the message that this very strangely worded letter was intended to convey. Well, to repeat again, my own view, as I discussed extensively in my program yesterday, is that Donald Trump will ultimately get what he wants, which is Greenland. I think more likely than not, there will be some sort of sale. He, in his Truth Social posts, is still talking about purchasing Greenland. And I believe this reflects sentiment, wider public sentiment in the United States, as apparently confirmed by opinion polls. So for the moment at least, Trump is holding back from sending in the US military and simply rounding up whatever European and Danish troops there are there, a couple of dozen I expect, and simply announcing that the territory is from now on American territory. It seems that Trump isn't currently planning to do that, though at any moment that might change. For the moment, he's still talking about purchasing Greenland. But it is essential to understand that in the event that there is a negotiation over Greenland, this will be a negotiation which is between two completely unequal parties. In that negotiation, Trump and the Americans hold all the cards, and any ideas that the Danes are going to get $800 billion from the United States for Greenland, I think is fantasy. I think that I would personally not be surprised if the amount of money that the Americans end up paying for Greenland is going to be token. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed at great length why I thought that would happen. By the way, I ought to say that Thomas Farsi wrote an article in Unheard about a week ago, making exactly the same point, that sooner or later the Europeans were going to would hand over Greenland to Donald Trump, to the Americans, that the position between them and the Americans is so unequal that they have no choice. And there's now been another follow-up article in Unheard, this time by Wolfgang Monschau, and he makes the same point. I'll just read a few paragraphs. He says, you can draw a neat line around the 8 countries Donald Trump has targeted for his 10% punitive tariff: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Britain, Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Europe's liberal northwest is trying to frustrate Trump's grab of Greenland. But there are 20 other member states, in NATO I should say, who have not been sanctioned. One is Italy. Giorgia Meloni has already said she told Trump that the threat was a mistake. I think it was too. But is Meloni going to break with Trump over a patch of land that is far away and irrelevant to Italy's security and economy? Will Spain? Will Greece? Greece, by the way, has in Prime Minister Mitsotakis a fervidly pro-American Prime Minister, just saying. Or Malta and Cyprus? What about Eastern Europe? Will Viktor Orban, Andrej Babiš, and Robert Fico, the populist prime ministers of Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, respectively, run to the rescue of their liberal friends in Denmark? Friends, of course, you could almost put in quotation marks, because, of course, they're not friends at all. Even Poland, with a government that is as pro-EU as it can get, is hardly going to sacrifice its strategic alliance with America over a few rocks of ice near the Arctic. Nor, of course, are the Baltic states, which Wolfgang Monschau doesn't mention. But there is no conceivable way that in their present catastrophically vulnerable position, which they have brought on themselves, the Baltic states are going to enter into a quarrel with the Americans that burns down NATO. They will resist with everything they have. And by the way, I think that even in the Liberal 8, in Britain, in Germany, certainly, in Finland, definitely, and Sweden too, you're going to find all sorts of people who ultimately say, we can't afford to quarrel with the United States. We must agree with them. We need the Americans here. We need them to help defend us from the Russians, because, as has become absolutely obvious over the last 4 years, the Europeans by themselves, if it ever did come to a conflict with the Russians, cannot defend themselves. But putting that aside, and to repeat again, there hasn't been a glimmer of a hint from the Russians that they have any aggressive intentions against any of these countries. Just to say, put aside the security dimension, the economics entirely are in America's favour. I noticed that in Wolfgang Munchau's article, nowhere in it does he mention that Trump can bring Europe to heel very quickly by interrupting American exports of LNG to Europe, which Europe now critically depends upon to keep what is left of its economy functioning. There's been some commentaries about the fact that the natural gas industry in the United States and the LNG industry in the United States are not financially in particularly good shape, that mostly up to now they've traded at a loss, that it's expensive exports of overpriced LNG to Europe, which have made the industry, the natural gas industry in the United States, finally turn a profit, that in that respect the Europeans are actively subsidizing the American natural gas industry. I've no doubt that all of this is true, but the key thing to understand is that this is not for the United States an existential matter. If some natural gas and oil businesses and companies in the United States run into financial problems, that's not going to bring America down or cause its economy to collapse. And of course, the reality is that the United States government itself, especially in the context of an economic war, can probably, in fact undoubtedly, would provide its own financial subsidies to these companies if it had to. Whereas for the Europeans, supply of LNG from the United States has become an existential issue. I discussed in my program yesterday how the Europeans have cut themselves off from supplies of pipeline gas from Russia, cheap pipeline gas from Russia. Just a few weeks ago, they took a further decision to cut themselves off from imports of LNG from Russia as well. I think this is just, literally a couple of weeks ago. The Russians, by now, cannot trust the Europeans as reliable trade partners in any conceivable way. And frankly, I think that Russian priorities now are to develop energy relationships with China and India and other Asian countries, and that they will not want to come back to the European market, or if they're invited to, they will not come back with the slightest enthusiasm, just saying. So what has happened is that the Europeans have lost a stable, cheap, reliable supplier that never used tools of economic coercion against the Europeans, or indeed anybody that I can immediately think of, and turned to an unstable, unreliable supplier, which has a long history of engaging in economic coercion against countries in every corner of the world, just saying. But they made that choice, and in terms of energy dependence, they have delivered themselves into the hands of the United States. And if the United States turns off the switch, if Donald Trump turns off the switch, well, I'm not going to try and guess what's going to happen to European industry. I don't think I have to. We've already seen over the last 4 years the de-industrialization processes take hold in Europe. We wouldn't any longer be talking, or so it seems to me, about de-industrialization. We would be talking about industrial collapse, which, by the way, just to add, de-industrialization in Germany continues to accelerate. And I read another article just 2 days ago that that because of the deindustrialization processes that are taking hold in Germany, German local governments, towns and cities across Germany, the local governments there, are all of them rapidly going bankrupt because the businesses that used to pay the local business taxes are unable to do so, and in many cases are going bankrupt or closing down. So, as I said, the switch for Donald Trump to press is there. Given the kind of person he is, I don't think he would hesitate for a moment to press it if he felt that that was the way he would gain control of Greenland. And I have no doubt that, in fact, he would press it. And long before we got to that point, the Europeans will back down. There is no way that they're going to get themselves into a long-scale, long-term trade war with the United States. It would undoubtedly present problems for the US economy. It might cause higher prices and higher inflation in the United States, which obviously, for political reasons, Donald Trump would not want to see. But the economic consequences for Europe would be far worse and far greater. So, at some point, the Europeans would back down, are going to back down. And my guess is that that will happen probably sometime in February, maybe in March. Donald Trump himself is apparently coming to Europe. He's going to attend Davos, the meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. All of the European leaders are rushing off to Davos to meet him, to try to get him to change his mind. I doubt that they will get him to change his mind. If he does change his mind, I predict that he will come back to the topic of Greenland within a week or two or a month or so. But sooner or later, the question of Greenland will come back, and nothing in the meantime will have been changed. And, well, anyway, I don't know what will come of these meetings, but I can't imagine that they can change the substantive realities in any significant way. My guess is, more likely than not, the Europeans coming to Davos, scrambling off to Davos, are going to find themselves humiliated all over again. As a European, I want to stress I take no pleasure in any of this. The humiliation and ruin of Europe upsets me, distresses me immensely. But let's be honest, we've brought this on ourselves. We have pursued for at least 10 years a monotrack policy of hostility to Russia. We have shaped our entire foreign policy around that priority. We've, as a result, not only destroyed our relations with Russia, but made ourselves intolerable to our interlocutors in all sorts of other places. The Indians, the Saudis, the Turks are all bored when European leaders like Annalena Baerbock and Kaja Kallas come round and come to talk about, and Ursula von der Leyen and all the others, and come to talk about Ukraine. The Chinese have been absolutely infuriated as the Europeans have sacrificed their relationship with China, their previously burgeoning relationship with China, in order to keep the United States on side ultimately in conducting Project Ukraine and in this extraordinary economic war and political and other war that they have been waging against Russia. And well, we are where we are as a result, left in a state of total dependence economically, geopolitically, in security terms, in terms of intelligence sharing. We're entirely dependent on the United States. On issues of energy export, it's worth pointing out that the Russians never achieved the sort of energy dominance over Europe. They were never, despite what many claim, the gas monopoly supplier to Europe. Whereas, of course, the Americans ultimately are exactly that. Speaking of China, there is an absolutely excoriating editorial about European policy in Global Times, a newspaper which, as I've discussed many times, is very close to the Chinese government and to the leadership of the Communist Party of China. The article, the editorial, its title is "Double Standards Are Backfiring on Europe," but actually it goes far beyond that. It says things like this. It says, the EU has been blinded by its cognitive bias of overstretching security concepts, using political manipulation to undermine normal bilateral economic and trade cooperation. Brussels plans to compel member states to phase out gradually Chinese-made equipment for critical infrastructure, covering telecom networks, solar power systems, even security scanners. Such measures have become increasingly common in recent years. They lack solid technical or legal justification and openly defy scientific reasoning and market logic. And they talk about how the EU has been putting pressure on China, on Spain rather, to end a recording storage equipment partnership it has with Huawei on the grounds that this is a security risk, and the effect that all of this is having, these policies are having in restricting the development of Europe's technologies. It says that what all of this is doing is keeping Europe, leaving Europe technologically behind, and it just makes this point. It says to pander to the political paranoia of an ally across the ocean. Obviously, that refers to the United States. The Europeans not only sacrifice their citizens' rights to enjoy advanced technology, but also hold back their own modernization. Europe bows to the United States at every turn, even at the expense of its own interests, yet it gains neither respect nor reciprocity, only intensified disdain and exploitation. Treating an ally's territorial sovereignty as a mere real estate transaction, and this is clearly a reference to Greenland, is an act of blatant hegemonic aggression and humiliation. However, in the face of such blatant violations of its sovereignty, Europe's response remains shockingly weak. All that Kaja Kallas can come up with is to claim that China and Russia must be having a field day due to the divisions amongst the Allies, a tone both servile and dangerously misguided. Now, obviously, the Chinese here are speaking in terms of their own interests and their own priorities. But who can seriously argue that they're not making a valid point? If you go out of the way, as the Europeans have done, to create a situation of total dependence, then you can't blame anyone but yourself if that person whom you have put yourself at such an extreme level of dependence upon is now taking advantage of it. Anyway, there it is. That's where the Europeans now are. I wonder how long it will be before the Europeans cave and give Donald Trump what he wants. To repeat a point I've made in the past, the appetite grows with the eating. Sooner or later, the Americans, perhaps even Trump, will come back for more. My own view is that Iceland, in particular, an independent country with a very long history and an astonishing culture, might be next on the menu. I hope I'm wrong. But anyway, sooner or later, the Americans will come and ask for more. And I can't imagine that the Europeans are going to sort themselves out or put themselves in any kind of position where they're going to change that. So anyway, there it is. Now, even as Trump is, well, not just making his increasingly forceful demands to the Europeans over Greenland and being shockingly rude to them as he goes about doing it. Even as he does that, he is now busy once again opening the door to the partner that he sometimes gives the impression that he wants to have, who is, of course, Russia's Vladimir Putin. Even as apparently he sent off this letter to the Prime Minister of Norway, Trump's officials have apparently been contacting the Kremlin and have said that Trump wants Putin, apparently Putin himself, to join the new peace board that Trump is busy setting up to administer the so-called ceasefire in Gaza. Here, perhaps, it's worth pointing out that there is actually no full ceasefire in Gaza. There's a very good article on this topic in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, by Paul Pilar, who points out that there is actually no existing ceasefire in Gaza. He says that according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, Israeli attacks since the start of the supposed ceasefire have killed at least 451 Palestinians and injured 1,251 others. There are regular strikes, and during the same period, at least 3 Israeli soldiers have been killed in combat. So there is no ceasefire. As Pilar also says, the Israelis are still, or at least appear to be, impeding supplies being sent to Gaza. But never mind, you still go and set up your board, and all sorts of interesting and important people are being invited to join. One of them is Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, something that the Arab states apparently are very unhappy about, as they remember his role in the Iraq War and even as they consider him to be someone who is structurally biased, heavily biased towards Israel. But Trump wants Blair on the board, and Blair is indeed there on the board. But other leaders have been invited to join too. President Erdogan of Turkey is one. President Milei of Argentina is another. President al-Sisi of Egypt, I believe, is yet another still. And now President Putin of Russia has also been invited to join. Or at least that is what the Russians are telling us. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said as much. I have no doubt at all that this is true. So Trump, again, is offering Putin a place at the table. And this board of peace, I ought to say, seems to me to be becoming increasingly disconnected from Gaza anyway. Apparently there's to be another entirely different body that is actually supposed to run Gaza, the Gaza Executive Board. Utterly nebulous what that is, unclear to me what that is, or who is actually going to be working for it. Apparently the Israelis are not happy about this Gaza Executive Board at all, mostly because it will include Turkish technocrats and Palestinian officials. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss a topic that I'm not fully informed about anyway. And it seems that the actual proconsul, the person who's supposed to run Gaza, in the meantime, as the Director General of, well, I'm not sure whether it's the Board of Peace or this Gaza Executive Board. Anyway, that person is Nicholas Mladenov, former Bulgarian foreign minister, I believe. Anyway, senior Bulgarian official, and somebody who, by the way, once upon a time, long ago, I used to know, and I used to know him quite well, but that was a very, very long time ago. And our paths went in different directions since long, for a long, long time since then. But anyway, the board, the peace board, has presumably some notional connections to the situation in Gaza. But the way Trump is talking about it now, it seems to be not just about Gaza or even about the Middle East, actually. It looks like what he seems to be trying to set up is some kind of, well, I was almost a kind of rival United Nations. He's going to get all his friends and the people he respects, including Erdogan and Putin. There's no word of an invitation to Xi Jinping, though maybe that will come, and Narendra Modi, but he's getting all of these people to join the board. He's saying that governments that want to join are welcome to do so. All they need to do is pay the United States $1 billion for the privilege. But anyway, the point to say is, Trump is again reaching out to Putin. He's offering him a place on this board, whatever it is that this board is supposed to do. And I suppose if there are ever going to be meetings of this board, meetings which I presume will take place in a virtual format, and with Trump as the chair, well, Vladimir Putin will be there on the board participating in this meeting. And so far, as I'm aware, none of the key European leaders have so far been invited. So anyway, that's what Trump is doing. Probably it will have no real purpose or meaning in the end, but the very fact that he's extending this invitation to Putin is going to annoy the Europeans. and it's already been the topic of negative commentary in the British media. And perhaps even more interestingly, Witkoff and Kushner are also coming with Trump to Davos, and they are expecting to meet Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's direct investment fund. He apparently is going to be in Davos too, and they're apparently going to have discussions with him. I find that a little surprising because I had assumed that Dmitriev had been sanctioned by the European Union and by Switzerland. So on that basis, I'm not sure how he's able to travel to Davos. Maybe I'm wrong about that, though if not, that does surprise me. But if he is sanctioned, then presumably the Americans have told the Europeans to waive the sanctions on him so that he can be in Davos and meet Kushner and Witkoff there. Presumably, they're going to discuss the kaleidoscope of different plans and proposals and counter-proposals that we've seen coming out from that duo since November, which have taken us no closer to a peace settlement at all, by the way. And presumably Witkoff and Kushner want to meet Dmitriev in order to get that invitation to travel to Moscow to meet Putin himself. Just saying. But anyway, so the Europeans are coming to Davos. They want to meet Trump. They'll presumably be avoiding Dmitriev, but the Americans are going to be meeting Dmitriev. Who knows? Maybe Trump himself will. Just saying. So all of this looking very untidy, very messy, and extremely unsatisfactory indeed from a European point of view. So anyway, the Russians have been watching this whole affair, this whole episode between the Americans and the Europeans over Greenland. And, well, they have been playing mischief over it. Kaja Kallas's comment about how the only people who are going to be pleased about this quarrel are the Chinese and the Russians, China and Russia. Well, it has provoked a certain amount of criticism from China, as I discussed, and as we saw from that Global Times article. And by the way, I agree with the Chinese criticism. I mean, to be talking and thinking about China and Russia when someone is coming for the territory of a country that is a member of the European Union, well, that does seem to me extraordinary. And it does well reflect Kaja Kallas's personal obsessions. But of course, the Russians are aware of these obsessions, and they're making hay about them. So, firstly, Kirill Dmitriev published a message on X in which he mocked the Europeans by telling them, be careful not to annoy Daddy. Daddy, of course, was what Mark Rutte, former Dutch Prime Minister, major EU personality, now Secretary General of NATO. Anyway, that was what Mark Rutte absurdly and, in my opinion, disgracefully called Donald Trump. And now Dmitriev is mocking him and the Europeans over it. And, well, the Russians have also been very busy circulating right across their foreign language media an article written by a Russian journalist, Nadezhda Romanovka. Now, I should say that she is a real person. Once upon a time, in Soviet times, as veterans of the Cold War, like Ray McGovern undoubtedly, well, of course, will remember, you would get interesting commentaries and articles appearing in the Soviet media, and Pravda especially, which would be published by over the names of invented fictitious individuals. There was obviously someone in the Kremlin who was really the drafter, but there was no actual person using the name with the name of the person of the supposed author of the article. Well, unlike that situation, Nadezhda Romanovka does indeed exist. She's an actual person. But the way in which the Kremlin, the Russian authorities, are going out of their way, Nadezhda Romanenko, are going out of their way to publicize this article, strongly suggests to me that there is a degree of intention about it. And basically what Romanenko is saying in this article is that whatever problems there are in the way, whatever objections there might be in the United States, if Trump acquires Greenland, he will have made his place in history. He will become a famous and be remembered as a famous and great president who expanded the territory of the United States to a degree, to an extent comparable to Thomas Jefferson when he negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. So, again, what the Russians are obviously doing is that they are flattering Trump and egging him on. They have no interest themselves in Greenland. They're saying to Trump, go ahead, do it. It will make you famous. It will make you great. And the Russians know that in the meantime, what it does is that it exposes the weakness and the folly of the Europeans, who the Russians, like Trump himself, by the way, despise. And if it creates more long-term trouble between the Americans and the Europeans, well, as far as the Russians are concerned, that would be a further plus. So anyway, the Russians are busy making as much trouble over this as they can. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they, after all of the things that the Europeans have done ever since the crisis in Ukraine got underway in 2014, and arguably even before, going all the way back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, when the Europeans first began to interfere in Ukraine in a big way. So anyway, there we are. That's the setup at the moment. Now, as to the negotiations, the diplomacy between Kushner and Witkoff and the Russians, I remain firmly of the view that the Russians have lost interest in it. And I don't think that Trump himself is particularly interested in it either. I think that whatever happens from this point going forward, the Ukraine, between America and Russia, the issue of Ukraine is going to gradually fade as a matter of very great importance in the relations between these two countries. They each have more important things to do with each other to a certain extent, but more important things to do generally. And, well, that then brings me back to the state of the war. Zelensky, by the way, before I get on to that, is also going to Davos. He sees every and any opportunity not to be in Kiev whenever he can, but he's also going to go to Davos. No doubt he will also want to meet with Donald Trump. It will be very interesting to see whether he does, but I get the sense that Trump at the moment is fed up with Project Ukraine, really doesn't want to concern himself more with it, and is prepared to focus on the Greenland issue, which is easier territory for him instead, and to prioritize that. Well, in the meantime, let's actually turn to the situation in Ukraine. There's been the various power blackouts across Ukraine continue. The situation in Kiev remains critical. There's an even worse situation in Kharkiv, as I discussed in my program yesterday. The situation in Dnipro is also incredibly bad, and apparently it's even worse in Odessa. So the situation is very, very difficult for the Ukrainians, and one can sense an air of crisis starting to build. The appointment by Zelensky of a ruthless and allegedly violent man with a criminal background to a leading position in Ukraine's major internal security agency, the SBU. According to reports, the nickname of this person within the criminal world in Ukraine, he's called the Strangler. Just saying. That's what I read in various pieces. It's events in Ukraine said that that is his nickname. I've no reason to doubt that that is true. So this is the kind of man that Zelensky is now recruiting into Ukraine's internal, putting in important positions in Ukraine's internal security agencies. And, well, as I said, we've had the prosecution of Tymoshenko, who has now made fiery statements about Zelensky in the Ukrainian parliament, identifying Zelensky with the far-right ideology of the 1930s, just saying. It's not just the Russians now. Zelensky himself had a meeting with General Zaluzhny, the ambassador of Ukraine to Britain, the person who used to command Ukraine's armies and who many people see as a potential political rival to Zelensky himself. My own view is that what Zelensky is trying to do is he's trying to win over Zaluzhny as the situation in Ukraine deteriorates and as the situation between Zelensky and other Ukrainian politicians who have been political allies of Zaluzhny, like Mayor Klitschko of Kiev, continue to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the new energy minister, Mr. Shmyhal, who was before defense minister of Ukraine and then before that prime minister of Ukraine, seems at a total loss what to do about the energy situation in Ukraine. There are reports that another Iskander strike has taken place against energy targets in Kharkiv, and apparently more drone attacks, Iran drone attacks, have taken place across Ukraine itself. And there was a very interesting article in Strana, the news website which is published outside Ukraine, but which might be described as representing the more mainstream, or at least the more rational opposition to Zelensky in Ukraine. Anyway, Strana spoke about how the attacks on the energy system in Ukraine are causing a cascade effect across the country, with smaller places and regions where there is still electric power obliged to transfer electric power to try to hold up the situation in the cities, which is becoming critical. By the way, on this topic, I received a very interesting email from somebody with a NATO background, NATO military background, who thought, as I do, that there is a real possibility that these attacks, the scale of the attacks on the energy system and various other military moves that the Russians are taking across Ukraine, particularly now in Sumy region, where more and more Russian troops seem to be entering and where the Russians seem to be expanding their territory and gradually moving closer and closer towards the city of Sumy itself, from which their commander, the commander group of forces north, General Nikiforov, recently said that his troops are only 20 kilometers away from Sumy city anyway. Anyway, I am starting to wonder, I'm increasingly starting to wonder whether some big offensive is being prepared by the Russians in precisely this area, with perhaps the reserve armies committed, and given that Kiev is the big city to the west here on the Dnieper, might it be that the attacks on Kiev and the blackouts in Kiev are indeed intended to prepare the ground for this offensive in the north? This correspondent who wrote to me, who sent this email, thought that there might be something to this idea. Anyway, we have had more news on the battlefronts, and it is intriguing. Firstly, the Russian Defense Ministry said this morning that a village called Pavlovka in Zaporozhye region has just been captured by the Russians. This place called Pavlovka is not difficult to identify. It has been captured by General Teplinsky's group of forces Dnieper, by paratroopers, Russian paratroopers, in fact. It is one of a cluster of villages to the northwest of Orekhov. It brings the Russians closer and closer to the supply roads to Orekhov that lead into Orekhov from the northwest. There's been a lot of information about Teplinsky's forces advancing in this area, and this confirms that the Russians are indeed in the process of capturing these villages, and if they can consolidate control of these villages, which of course they will, then that opens the way for an advance towards the road, towards an important settlements called Yurkivka and Tavrichevska, and if these places are captured, then the trap on Orekhov from the northwest will have closed. So this is an easy advance to understand. But there's been another advance. The Russian Defense Ministry have also said that a village called Novopavlivka has also been captured, and that this is a Novopavlivka in Donetsk region. So it is not the big fortified town of Novopavlivka to the west of Pokrovsk, which the Russians have been laying siege to for some months now, which is in Dnipropetrovsk region. This is another Novopavlivka, and I think this is probably a Novopavlivka, which is located to the north of the village of Sofevka, northwest of Pokrovsk. And, well, General Gerasimov was recently in that area. As I said, it seemed to me, from the way that he was speaking and the kind of plans that he seemed to be working on, that this is where the main axis of the Russian advance was going to come, the Schwerpunkt, if you like, to use a German military expression. And it could be that the Russians are indeed in the process of capturing the villages in this area as they work towards a complete encirclement of Konstantinovka, and as they also work towards an eventual siege and the creation of a cauldron around the two important towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. A former Ukrainian politician, Viktor Medvedchuk, the leader of the opposition to Zelensky in Ukraine, who was arrested by Zelensky early on in the war and who is now in exile in Russia. He was exchanged by the Russians. The Russians managed to exchange him for some of the people that they hold. Anyway, Medvedchuk said categorically that there is not going to be any peace agreement in Ukraine in 2026. The conflict will continue. And, well, with this enormous blackout, which, as I said, I don't myself see how the Ukrainians are going to reverse, and with the further advances of the Russian army, and with the reserve armies ready to be deployed, my sense is that if we're not yet in the end game, in military terms, before long we will be. And when I speak of an end game, I don't just mean an end game of the battle in Donbass. I mean an end game of the war in Ukraine, which will end in an unqualified Russian victory and with the Russians dictating terms. Now, I should say that I've also received significant information from a source about the Oreshnik strike. I'm getting a lot of information from many different sources, and open sources and private sources. This source said that the Russians engaged in a degree of subterfuge over this particular Oreshnik strike, that Putin himself was absolutely furious about the attack on his Valdai residence in Novgorod because members of his family are there. And by the way, there's been already reports to that effect. There's been reports to that effect in the British media as well. So that Putin was furious about what was not just an attack on him, but on members of his family. That there was indeed a lengthy discussion in Moscow over the Christmas New Year holiday. Much of it conducted, well, all of it conducted in secret, but much of it conducted using very, very secure communications channels. That it was agreed that the Russians would take very tough action in response to the drone attack on Valdai, and that the Russians deceived the Americans and the Ukrainians and the West by giving them a tip-off that a major facility would indeed be attacked in Ukraine using the Oreshnik, but leading them to think that this facility would be located in Kiev, causing complete surprise when the Oreshnik instead attacked a facility in Lvov. And this report says that there were quite a few Westerners in Lvov, mostly Germans and French, and that a lot of them were caught up in the attack, and that at least some of them, probably many of them, were killed. Now, I cannot corroborate any of this, and I noticed that Professor Postol has now provided his own analysis of the latest Oreshnik strike. Up to now, all of the information I've had about the Oreshnik strike has come from engineers and people with military backgrounds and people with intelligence backgrounds. I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Postol's views, which from a scientific perspective I consider authoritative. So anyway, probably I will discuss them in my next program. But I'm going to conclude this program with a very, very general observation. My own sense is that just as we're probably moving towards a military conclusion of the war in Ukraine, Project Ukraine altogether is now in its last gasp, going through its last gasps. There's even an article, I think it was in the New York Times, which says that the conflict between the Europeans and the Americans has left Ukraine basically without sponsors. The reality is actually harsher. The Americans stopped supporting Ukraine when it became clear that Ukraine could not achieve its military objectives on the battlefield, that the objective of Project Ukraine to achieve some kind of crisis in Moscow and to split Russia from China was not going to be achieved, and that Ukraine was absorbing a disproportionate share of American resources, especially weapons and financial resources. The Americans, sooner or later, came to the view, this goes beyond the personality of Donald Trump, that this was a failed enterprise, and they began to distance themselves from it, and they're not really interested any longer in re-engaging with it. The Europeans, for their part, over the course of the last year, have had their own dependence on the Americans brought home to them, and they've also had to face the reality that without the Americans, sustaining Project Ukraine is beyond their financial and military resources. The argument about seizing the Russian assets that took place at the end of last year was the clearest indicator of this. And, well, the Europeans have never come up with any plan and anything that remotely resembles a plan of how the war can be continued in military terms. And, of course, they're now at the point of extremis in financial ones. The Ukrainians themselves, well, sometimes they still talk a brave game. General Syrskyi, as he regularly does, said that Ukraine needs to go on the offensive somewhere, take the military offensive in some place. I don't think anybody looking at the situation on the battlefields places any faith in that. And of course, at a time when the cities in Ukraine are without power, how does Syrskyi expect to organize an offensive of the kind that he's talking about? He's talked about offensives many times, and they have happened in the past. They happened in 2023 with the offensive in Zaporozhye. They happened in 2024 with the offensive in Kursk. Both of those offensives ended in disaster. I think there was no such offensive in 2025. I cannot imagine that there's going to be one in 2026. But the point is that the Ukrainians are also now at the limits of their resources. They're running out of men. Every commentator says so. There's hardly any dispute about this any longer, that the Ukrainian army cannot replace its losses through recruitment. The Ukrainian economy is in a state of total collapse. Its military production is a fraction of the size of Russia's, and always has been. And help from the United States at the level that took place between, from the start of the special military operation until the end of 2024, help from the United States has basically run out, not because the Americans don't want to provide that aid, but because they are tapped out. The Russians have outlasted them all. They've outlasted the Europeans, the Americans, and the Ukrainians as well. They're still grinding forward, but perhaps we're getting closer anyway to the point of the knockout blow. So, given that this is the case, it's unsurprising that the Americans are now thinking of other things: Greenland, Venezuela, Iran, whatever. None of them can quite substitute for Ukraine. Ukraine, a defeat there, remains a far bigger, far more important, far more world-shaping thing. But the Americans are not going to invest in a project that is lost, and the Europeans would love to, but they're coming up against the limits to their resources. So my own view is that this story, well, we're not there at the end, but it's starting to move towards its end. The energy that existed in the West is draining away, even as the Russians continue to advance. So this is where I finish my own program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, and Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.